If you're part of any literary discussion circles or just spend a lot of time hanging out with people over the age of 35, you've probably heard the term Kafkaesque thrown around. This term is used to compare something to the works of Franz Kafka, a Bohemian Jewish writer who lived from 1883 to 1924. It's most often used for film, literature, and theater, and in common use references very specific tropes and elements of Kafka's style. To be frank, the term is quite played out. Characters in media will use Kafkaesque to signal to the audience their pseudo-intellectualism, and both the term and those who favor it have become the butt of jokes. So, what does it mean? And why did people use it so much it became cliche? In this video, I'd like to take a deeper dive on the tropes and themes of Kafka's short stories, as well as where their legacies can be seen today. Kafka is most famous for his short stories and two novels. His works vary greatly, but they all include some element of the surreal, and are generally dark and grim. Perhaps it will be easier to start with what Kafkaesque isn't. Kafka's style can't simply be summed up by the absurd or surreal. These terms today are part of Kafka's style, certainly, but as artistic movements, they don't fit Kafka's work so easily. Absurdism, described first by Kierkegaard, before Kafka's time, and later explored by Camus after Kafka's death, is the attempt and failure of mankind to find meaning in life by rational examination. Both authors eventually develop a philosophy that revolves around courageously facing meaninglessness and relying on faith. Surrealists, working after Kafka's time, describe a process of creating art that incorporates the dream reality and follows associations not apparent to the rational waking mind. These images and writings represent a super-reality to the surrealist. The movement's leader, André Breton, stated explicitly that surrealism was chiefly a philosophical revolution, not just an aesthetic. Struggling with meaning and dreamlike qualities are aspects of Kafka's work, but the conclusions and statements of these movements are too narrow to fit Kafka's style. The boys at Oxford English describe oppressive or nightmarish qualities as being indicative of a Kafkaesque work, so that may be a good place to start. One nightmarish trope of Kafka's work is the transformation into the non-human. The Metamorphosis, arguably Kafka's best-known work, describes a man who wakes up one morning having been transformed into an enormous insect. This man, Gregor Samsa, has to deal with life in his new body for the next several days. He loses his ability to eat normal food, and eventually any food at all. His family, after realizing what's happened, are initially supportive, but begin to neglect this creature with whom they can no longer relate. The story ends with him starving to death. Notice in the sample text shown that the physicality of Samsa's transformation is crucial to the story. The vermin state of Kafka's character is not merely symbolic or aliteral, but physical. The trope of physical transformation has a spiritual echo in visual media, particularly film. Here's my first unconventional Kafkaesque works, the film subgenre of body horror. Through film, the physical can be represented in a completely new way. The 1958 film The Fly is a great example of such a visual accomplishment. I think most are hesitant to describe entertainment and mainstream media as Kafkaesque, as these lower prestige-type media tend to undermine the intellectualism the term Kafkaesque hopes to imply. Fly and other body horror films during and following the 1950s embody a major component of Kafka's works, though, the use of physical transformation and disfigurement to disturb and disquiet. Notice in this iconic clip from The Fly, the audience is viewing the scene through the eyes of the transformed figure. It is not the monster on screen that's terrifying, but being or becoming the monster on screen. The reader occupies the grotesque in Kafka as well. So the disquieting, we could call it nightmarish, aspects of Kafka are important to what makes something Kafkaesque. We could call this trope the disturbing transformation or the first-person grotesque. The next Kafka trope we might explore is his depiction of the bureaucracy, possibly called the oppressive system or the injustice of law. Kafka was very familiar with the legal system in Germany during his life and seems to have become disenchanted with the justice system. Kafka seems less focused on active oppression and violence by the state, more with the immobility and complexity of the system. The law exists to Kafka as an enormous, stagnant force. It cannot be conquered or comprehended. In modern terms, the dystopia might be a parallel to Kafka's statements on law and government. Less elegant than the allegories and ironic statements Kafka used, the dystopian work drastically exaggerates the failures and oppressions of the state to criticize the current establishment. Some of these works are more like hero myths. The individual takes on the tyranny to free the people. These are distinctly not Kafkaesque, but others can be closely related to Kafka's depictions of bureaucracy. While not the first dystopian novels, probably the best known are Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984. In both of these works, the state is an entity so complex and large there is no hope of resistance, and the central character is someone lost in the system, never able to grasp or see the full function of the machine they're in. Since then, many mainstream films have used the futurist dystopia as a setting for various genres and stories, contrasting to the methodically described cold realism of Huxley and Orwell. These films, loosely fitting in the genre of sci fi and cyberpunk, often make use of color, lighting, music, and CGI to create surreal and impressive visual environments. While most of these works of both literature and film are more on the nose than Kafka, his depiction of the oppressive and absurd bureaucracy are certainly still relevant in culture. It should also be noted that the oppressive in Kafka isn't limited necessarily to oppressive government or law. The family, the environment, the home, or the self can be the oppressor in Kafka. So that's a mere glimpse into the two aspects popularly mentioned when Kafkaesque is defined. In a sort of rapid-fire fashion, I'd also like to mention several other major tropes in Kafka that academics and others have identified. Some things you might find in Kafka and the many works he's inspired are the mouth, eating, and consumption. Another of his most famous stories is The Hunger Artist, or The Starving Artist, detailing the life of a performance artist whose entire show is starving himself for over a month at a time. Eating, finding food, consuming, and descriptions of parts of the mouth are a common trope that recur in Kafka's works. Another is labor, or work, the way it torments the laborer. In The Burrow, a strange, mole-human-esque creature exerts work and builds his burrow by slamming his head against the wall or digging. Labor and the necessity of work is often a tormenting or oppressive force. Another is the perspective of an animal character, or some sort of creature. In Josephine, the Mouse People, a mouse singer is described in contrast to the mouse laborers. In Report to an Academy, an ape says that he's turned into a man through his education. So the animal figure in Kafka is not always the result of a transformation. Sometimes he contrasts animals and humans to show the distinction between different classes of people. Another trope is the title or rank of someone being used as their identifier or name. In The Penal Colony is called the explorer or the traveler. The other central character who describes the workings of a grisly execution machine is called only the officer. Similarly, the country doctor features a central character defined by his job. This is a trope that's still used quite frequently in media. Another trope Kafka sometimes explores is the condition of the artist and the artist's relation to his audience. This conflict is at the core of The Hunger Artist as well as Josephine, the Singer of the Mouse People. Lastly, many of Kafka's works have a sort of dark irony to them, or black comedy even. This is a bit of a debated topic as to the extent of the irony in Kafka's works, how much of it should be taken seriously, and how much of it is comedic in a sense. I won't get too far into it, but I believe that a good portion of Kafka's work is deeply ironic and even comical. So when people say Kafkaesque, they typically mean that something is surreal, oppressive, and possibly ironic, especially if it involves bureaucracy or maybe insects. The term has become a bit cliched. It seems to occupy a role of symbolic gatekeeper between the uneducated and the intelligentsia, though recently it's become a bit too overused to fulfill this role correctly. Nevertheless, if you see something that screams out to you with the qualities we discussed here and reminds you of Kafka, feel free to let the label fly. As long as you can back it up, I think the term Kafkaesque is still productive to start a discussion. Now, as a bonus at the end of the video, here are my top 5 Kafka short story power rankings, as well as some contemporary material I find to be keenly Kafkaesque. There, take a moment to soak these in. These are just my personal favorites, and most return to Kafka stories, not necessarily an essentials or starting list. You should certainly check out The Trial as well if you're going through his work. For contemporary media, check out the bizarre, surreal, and tragic films of Charlie Kaufman. I'd watch these in the order they're released, as I find that Charlie Kaufman tends to build upon himself artistically. Kaufman also explores the role of the artist and his relationship to his audience in the way that Kafka does. I think that this element of Kafka is sometimes overlooked, so it's a good place to look. For more nightmarish film experiences, check out the films listed here. They are mostly for the strong of stomach, especially Funny Games and Antichrist. These films use a great job of not only creating sets, but using camera work to create a sense of isolation and dread. Michael Haneke, in particular, might be an interesting director to look at, as he has a relationship with Kafka's work. He directed an film adaptation of The Castle early in his career. Lastly, here's a bit of a grab bag of films that I find interact with Kafka's tropes in various ways. I've omitted any and all direct adaptations of Kafka's works, as they're a little obvious. Anyhow, have fun with any and all material and ideas presented here, and feel free to leave your own ideas of Kafkaesque or your favorite Kafkaesque media in the comments section below.